Okay. Guys, welcome to Genesis. Tonight we are going to speak about abortion with our wonderful speaker and actually the main speaker of the group, Mr. William Gairdner. And the floor is yours. Please educate us.
Thank you. Thank you again for having me. Okay, this is a topic, the seriousness of which I don't think can be exaggerated, not possible. I think it's probably the most serious issue of a moral and ideological kind underlying the entire Western world and all the free societies of the world. I realize that abortion has often happened in unfree societies, of course, in very large numbers. But I say it's the most important ideological issue because in free societies, it's been freely chosen, brought out in the open, and supported as an ideological foundation of the Western democratic liberty. And the first part of this talk, I'm going to deal with the pros and cons of that part of the discussion. And in the last part of this talk, I'm going to read to you and discuss some very disturbing facts about the abortion regimes in which we're all now engaged, which I draw from my book, The War Against the Family. Anybody who wants the more ideologically oriented discussion can go to The Great Divide. I have a whole chapter 16 on that, from which I'm going to draw today. And if you want the grisly stuff, including the methodology by means of which countries like Canada and the USA, excuse me, and certain European nations wiggled their way into justifying the killing of unborn children in the womb, you will find it in The War Against the Family. And I can only say you better be sitting down if you read that stuff. It will bring tears to your eyes. So here, let me start from the section in The Great Divide. About 35 years ago, during a lunch meeting, the political writer David Frum's actually a Canadian, but he's been living and working in the United States for decades now. And I think currently he's the chief editor of a magazine called Atlantic Monthly, which I would say, unfortunately, under his leadership has gone farther left than it already was. And anyway, David's a nice guy, and we were having lunch together, and he asked me, what do you think the single most defining moral issue of the future will be? And without hesitation, I said abortion. And I gave as my reasoning that the architects of our formerly liberal, but now very egalitarian democracies had not yet come to confession. They have not yet fessed up that the mass killing of millions of unborn children in the free world is the price they were willing to pay for ideological purity. You have to think about that line. It's the abortion, the killing of unborn children, is the price they were willing to pay for ideological purity. In other words, to make their conception of democracy pure. Which is to say that the abortion right is the final political outcome, solution, and nexus of a centuries-long encounter between liberal democracy in its present mutated form and conservatism. Or, to put it another way, the encounter between the demands of political equality and the unavoidable lifestyle inequalities experienced by women as dictated by their own natural biology. Pure classical liberal democracy could have continued for a long time without an abortion right. But once it mutated into an egalitarian form, it required a method for erasing the glaring natural differences between the freedom naturally available to one half of the citizenry and the other. In a liberty-based regime, biology is accepted as a natural difference between the natural genders. I have to put the word natural in there because people are fictionalizing the idea of gender today. But this was written before all that began. But in an egalitarian regime, biology threatens equality of liberty. Hence, the modern war against biology. And by the way, that line, this book was published in 2015, before all this woke nonsense came to the surface. So, hence the modern war against biology emphasized throughout this book. The solution to this otherwise natural state of affairs was to create an abortion right, permitting the voluntary purgation of biologically based lifestyle inequalities. In my apolitical, knee-jerk liberal youth, I supported abortion under the usual reasoning that whatever the girl was carrying, it was just a bit of inert tissue, that it was great to have a backup plan available, and that because having a baby would ruin a young girl's life, an unwanted baby that is, would ruin a young girl's life, the abortion option was a no-brainer, as it seemed at the time. But over time, and due to extraordinary medical and scientific revelations showing what is really in there, and because I eventually had children of my own and witnessed the whole miraculous creation of human life, I began to change. In previous sections of this book, I have alluded to this topic because it is so intimately connected to the opposing beliefs that liberals and conservatives tend to hold about the dominion of will over nature, or the reverse, about God or the absence of God, about religion, materialism, and so much more. I will lay out some disturbing facts on abortion here, and then ask a handful of pertinent questions, which I invite readers, in this case listeners, to answer as honestly as possible. And then I ask them to reflect on the linkage explored here between the abortion right, democratic ideology, and the standard legal technique for converting human beings into material things or property, because it's this alone that has made human slavery possible throughout history, whether inside or outside the womb. Again, not all liberals support abortion, and not all conservatives are against it, and many are in the middle and on the fence. But in broad brush terms, most liberals are pro-abortion, modern liberals that is, and most true conservatives are anti-abortion. Again, I specify the word true conservatives because so-called fiscal conservatives are seldom true conservatives. They are more like libertarians who usually support choice in all things, including abortion. Note also that I did not use the favored liberal freedom term pro-choice. And that is simply because everything we do or decline to do requires a choice. We choose to abort or not to abort, so choice must be rejected as a meaningful term. Instead, let's cut to the chase. Today there is such angry polarization between liberals and conservatives on the question of abortion that consensus is considered impossible, and if the citizens of the modern democracies share anything, it is a sense of relief that this and many other morally difficult matters are routinely decided by the edicts of courts. Don't bother me and my conscience is the underlying feeling. And the activities of those courts seem aimed at efficiently deflecting genuine public debate. It's another topic, but I believe that the tendency for elected representatives in democratic legislatures to avoid lacerating debate over difficult moral issues by pushing them upstairs for a decision by unelected judges is a form of moral and political cowardice that has contributed to the infantilization of ostensibly democratic populations and is directly linked to the decline of classical liberal democracy in our time. It's also directly responsible for the mutation of that original form of democracy into what I call its hyper-democratic or hyper-egalitarian form, such as we have today. And that is why we need to ask, what happened? Why, in less than a half century, did the citizens of almost every modern democracy change in character from a people who once valued human life so highly that they criminalized all abortion with a profound moral certainty, with only a few exceptions having to do with rape or a real threat to the life of the mother, the threat of death, that is, to a people so liberalized that in a country like Canada, which since 1988 has had no law whatsoever against abortion, they publicly subsidize the right to terminate human life in the womb at any stage of pregnancy, even up to the moment of natural birth. Some will immediately object to the phrase human life on the ground that almost all courts of the free world typically take the modern liberal view that a fetus is not legally a person or a human being until it is born alive. That's the phrase, born alive. Such legal and verbal legerdemain, however, is now a fact of Western life. But there are other facts forming a chain of logic that should expose what the conservative considers the bogus use of such terms. Even if we all were to agree that what a pregnant woman is carrying is not a fully developed person or a human being, we nevertheless cannot deny that in every case, what she is carrying is alive. Were this not so, there would be no need for anyone to claim a right to, the word is terminate, a pregnancy. In other words, whether pro-abortion or anti-abortion, those taking shelter under any of these euphemisms nevertheless are in fact talking about actual life, and not what some judges describe as potential life. So step one in my argument is that both liberals and conservatives are obliged by the evidence to agree that what a pregnant woman is carrying is alive. It's a form of life. Step two, the conservative insists, is then to admit the plain truth that in every case, absolutely, the life a pregnant woman is carrying is a human life. For no one believes that she is carrying a live puppy or a swan. And having come this far, and only once we decide to face this singular truth as honestly as possible, the conservative then wants to ask a crucial question. Namely, how can it be morally acceptable for one person in full possession of his or her own human life to terminate the human life of another? The saying I once heard, and this really went right to my heart, quote, all who support slavery are free, and all who support abortion are alive, drove home to me like a stake in the heart the naked injustice in the act of one human being who was not aborted deciding to end the life of another human being. By any measure, most people, whether liberal or conservative, who adamantly support abortion are grievously uninformed, and they never think about these arguments. They simply don't know how we have arrived at the new moral ground that we suddenly seem to be standing on. What changes in the law have enabled such a strange about-face? And finally, what the current practices of abortion are that this shift in morality and law have made possible. The answers explored here are each followed by a plain question. Here's a section now called How We Got This Way, the change in our moral thinking. Until about the middle of the 19th century, most philosophers and religious and political leaders in the Western world accepted as obvious the idea that we live and ought to live under common moral understandings, which is to say, as explained elsewhere in this book, moral standards until very recently were considered communal and public by their very nature. The mere idea that morality should serve the private interests or circumstances of solitary individuals had heretofore always been considered absurd, if not a sign of simple moral incapacity. But with the growing emphasis on individual freedom and equality and the retreat from religion and community authority came the increasingly shrill demand for private individual rights divorced from duties. And with this, an entirely new idea came along, namely that each human makes up his or her own private morality with every individual choice. This, in turn, shined a light on private individual will as the key determinant of moral authenticity, as it slowly became a substitute for public moral understandings. Elsewhere in this book, I have pointed to John Stuart Mill's so-called harm principle as the most notorious formulation of that process of substitution, whereby community moral standards in so many Western nations have been elbowed aside in favor of individual rights and freedoms. Now I want to talk about the flimsy legal right. Canada, for example, has had the most liberalized abortion regime in the history of the world since 1988, when unfettered abortion at any stage of pregnancy up to the moment of natural birth, as I have said, became possible. In that year, a law placing certain strict conditions on abortion was struck down as unconstitutional because, guess why? Because abortion services were not equally available everywhere in the country. In other words, inequality was being cited as a reason to get rid of our law against abortion. A law made by the people that declared unlimited abortion a crime was therefore struck down because the crime was not equally available to all women. The result is that Canadian law to this day does not say that abortion is right or wrong. It actually says nothing at all, even though no poll in that putative democracy has ever shown that a majority of Canadians accept unlimited abortion on demand. We have no polls in our country which have ever said that. And we also find that once you start telling people that there are all sorts of abortions that take place in the second and even the third trimester, they immediately become more conservative and start restricting the extent to which they accept abortion of any kind, which is interesting in itself. As in so many other democracies, however, the conjuring began the moment liberal intellectuals and judges decided, mostly for radical feminist reasons, having to do with the growing demand for gender equality and moral autonomy, that a woman ought to have a right to choose abortion. However, This was a right that could only be exercised by first invoking a well-known and frequently used legal technique for reducing a specific class of human beings, in this case unborn human beings, to the status of property, or that of an offensive animal, or of a disease. This political, legal, and psychological technique has been widely used in human history in many ancient societies, certainly by the Germans and the Soviets during the Second World War. So I say especially in totalitarian regimes and dictatorships. In fact, it was first used as a technique for reducing human beings to the nature of a material thing during the French Revolution, at which time almost everything we saw in the atrocities of the Second World War was practiced by the French revolutionaries against their own citizens. So this political, legal, and psychological technique, as I say, has been widely used in human history, especially in totalitarian regimes and dictatorships. Whenever states, politicians, or courts seek to justify the incarceration, enslavement, or slaughter of an enemy, especially, get this, of people they called internal enemies, people who opposed the dominant ideology of the government, were described as internal enemies and reduced to a condition of ideological slavery so that their lives could be manipulated and easily terminated. It is important to make the conservative case that this subversive legal technique has been exactly duplicated by all Western liberal democracies in a sinister parallel that is far more than an analogy and that can be summed up in the following statement. And I couldn't be feeling more strongly about these points. And I'm sorry to say I seem to be one of the very few who is stressing them, but I hope that someday human populations will come to recognize the truth of what I am saying here. So, what did I say? In the sinister parallel that is far more than an analogy and can be summed up in the following statement. Here we go. There is no difference between a declaration of non-personhood that creates, objectifies, and makes, here's the key thing, makes invisible to its perpetrators a class of born alive slaves such as have existed in all regimes of chattel slavery, and a declaration of non-personhood that creates, objectifies, and makes invisible to its perpetrators a class of alive but unborn slaves, such as exist in the wombs of pregnant women in almost all liberal democratic regimes. Some regimes have banned abortion, then brought it back, and then banned it again. Not sure exactly which they are, maybe Ireland for a while, maybe Poland. But all the other Western democracies have active abortion regimes which rely for their ideological defense and success, so to speak, on this slave-making capacity of political ideology. If this logical and factual parallel holds, as I think it does, it points to the shocking conclusion that almost all the major democracies of the Western world have become slave regimes of a new kind. And this has been made possible only by the sanctification of individual will as their primary and, in fact, their only moral foundation. It's very interesting. My wife and I just had lunch today with a wonderful friend I've known for 50 years, a young athlete I met years ago when I was training for the Olympic Games. And he and his wife came for lunch. And he's a black man. He and his wife are both blacks. He came from Jamaica, lives in Canada, lovely guy, lovely people. But I can't get it through his head that he, above all, should deplore human slavery, in which black people were defined as non-human beings. I asked him, so what do you think of the fact that we're now defining unborn human beings as non-human beings? Wouldn't you say that's a form of slavery? And I get a kind of silence in response. In other words, we aren't there yet as a people where we can actually see the truth of what I'm arguing here. And I remember that lovely song, we all know it, I once was blind, but now I see, the song called Amazing Grace. It's true, I once was blind, but now I see. And once you see, you can't not see the truth of these statements. Now, a physician friend throws this technique of pure will into stark relief by asking why, on one side of a 1-inch thick hospital wall, physicians are spending millions of dollars on high-tech machinery and surgical skill to save and preserve the life, yes, the life of a 3-pound premature baby. While on the other side of the wall, which is only like 1 inch thick, other physicians are about to throw an aborted baby of exactly the same weight and gestation into the garbage. Clearly, if at the same moment, at the same moment in time, the two mothers decided or willed to make opposing choices, in other words, to change their minds, the first child would become legal garbage and disappear as a human being, while the second child would suddenly and miraculously arise from the deadness of its thinghood and be declared fully and legally human and saved. The source of such an existential transformation is only the naked will of the mothers. Take note, the fathers have no legal say, at least in my country, whereby human life is created ex nihilo or extinguished ex nihilo, not by God or by biology, but by human will alone, which is why I often say we fancy, those of us who live in these modern democratic regimes, carry on as if we're little godlets now, making crucial decisions such as these, which in the past we all agreed only God could make. I am not at the moment focusing on just the moral question. I'm simply trying to present the bald truth that as a political extension of the will to triumph over nature, the Western democracies, by ideological imperative, their own ideological imperative, have adopted a legal technique for converting millions of human beings into objects or subhuman beings, and thereby have converted themselves into slave regimes of a new kind. This is especially odd because if we use the word disappear as a verb, it is clearly possible to disappear a man as a human being and make him reappear as a chattel slave, just as it is possible to disappear an unborn child and make it reappear as a womb slave. The essence of all human slavery is the transformation of a human life into an object that is owned and controlled as the property of another. And yet, the same liberal who insists that chattel slavery is simply like my friend, my black friend, who insists that chattel slavery is simply abhorrent and unconscionable, which he does, will very likely support womb slavery and abortion as an important expression of a woman's democratic freedom, which he does, you see, and he doesn't see the contradiction in his own thinking. Conservatives like me, who reveal this parallel to their liberal friends like him, will be astonished at the unwillingness of abortion sympathizers to see and condemn this form of slavery. It has been rendered invisible to them by their own will. Again, I once was blind, but now I see. The reasoning produced for striking down Canada's abortion law and granting a pregnant woman and her alone a right to decide the life or death of her unborn child was that if any woman who did not want her child did not have equal access to abortion, then this is the word they used, the security of the mother's person, which now means not just her physical, but also her psychological health as a freely choosing individual, has been put at risk. Note the irony, put at risk by her own will. She was then said to be justified in protecting herself from this insecurity threat by demanding the almost always tax-funded professional removal of the offending object or enemy from her womb. The same sort of legal and verbal legerdemain was used in the United States, where the justifying ground for this practice was not security, but the mother's right to, guess what? To privacy. If the life within the womb is unwanted by its own mother, it is considered a kind of enemy object, occupying the property of the mother's womb without her consent. An illegal trespasser that, notice the word that and not who, has invaded her privacy. Here again we have an echo of the originating narrative of modern democracy, namely that citizens should not be controlled by laws that do not have their consent. This goes right back to John Locke and his incredible influence on the formation of the so-called Atlantic democracies like America and Canada, where consent was at the basis of his whole argument, that a people consents to its own government, and if its own government does things it doesn't like, it can consent to revolt against the government and throw them out. What John Locke never confessed to was that no government in history has ever been formed by pure consent. Not one that you can name. They're all formed by tradition and custom and historical evolution of their laws and traditions. So anyway, as I say, this is an echo of the originating narrative of modern democracy. Just as their bodies should not be controlled or occupied by another without their consent. Surely the most arch, self-centered, and bizarrely twisted argument in this vein was made by a man named Murray Rothbard. Murray is a hero of sorts to modern libertarians, has written a lot of books about them, and to modern liberals. In his seminal book entitled For a New Liberty, The Libertarian Manifesto, that's the whole title, Rothbard relied on all three of the most common ploys. He first described the unborn child as a fetus, using the Latin, of course, to imply a valueless thing or a non-human object. And then he moved right along to the themes of the fetus, both as occupying enemy, he said this, and as a disease, by insisting that whenever a fetus occupies a womb, his word unbidden, if it occupies a womb unbidden or unasked or uninvited, it is like, his word, a parasite. The unborn child is now a parasite, an unwanted aggressor on its own mother, who, in demanding her right to abort, is only acting in self-defense. And so the fetus aggressor must forfeit its own life. It's absolutely shocking, I hope you agree. This same sequence of arguments has been used throughout history by all those who seek to dehumanize their enemies before killing them. In modern times, more or less, the French Revolution, we saw this full panoply of stuff in play. And of course, in the 20th century totalitarian regimes and every other regime in human history, we have seen this technique used. The Nazis described the Jews and others as parasites. Gloria Steinem, the poster woman for radical feminism in the 70s, a Jewish woman herself, by the way, argued that a woman should have the right to remove any parasitic growth from her body. Now, here's a shocker for you. In 1989, the Canadian artist Rick Gibson and the owner of a London, Ontario gallery that had exhibited his work were both fined a few $100s for outraging public decency. Now, what had Gibson done to draw this anger from the municipality? He placed artwork in the gallery. It was a sculpture entitled Human Earrings. It was a female mannequin, like a head, a fake head of a woman, with earrings on it made of freeze-dried human fetuses. He actually was able to get his hands on actual unborn children about that size, about the size of a 50-cent piece. And he freeze-dried them and made earrings out of them. To the conservative, however, the arguments that the unborn child is an unbidden enemy in its mother's womb cannot be dignified by the name of reasoning. The most telling retort is that we might as well give a starving man money and then call him an aggressor against our property and murder him to get it back. So the second crucial question is, can it be right and good for any civilization that the decision regarding whether another human life has intrinsic value or not, and so whether he or she is to be protected by society or killed, should be made according to the changeable will of a single individual? And now I want to talk about the practice of abortion, to which I'm going to add, if we have time at the end, from the War Against the Family. Now let us ask what is actually being done to unwanted human life. How many unborn lives are ended? How large are they? And what are the methods? Once those who are pro-abortion learn a little of the bald truth, many are horrified. They begin backpedaling a lot, and they start to suggest ways to restrict abortion, if not to end it. This grisly aspect will only be touched upon here. As I say, I'll touch upon it deeply if we have time. But suffice it to say that of the approximately 1.1 million or so abortions performed annually in the United States, this was published in 2015, when that number was true. It's down a bit now, I think. It's down from a peak even then of 1.4 million in 1990. And the more than 120,000 performed in Canada, which is 1/10 of the size of the U.S. in population terms. Most are done in the first trimester of pregnancy. We know that. The vast majority of these aborted souls would have been perfectly healthy citizens. In other words, there was nothing wrong with them. The routine methods of abortion at this stage involve things like vacuum aspiration, or, if later than 12 weeks, injection with a saline solution that burns and kills these babies, scraping the womb, and so on. Many people who support abortion don't know much about the details of this horrendous subject. They believe all abortions take place very early in the pregnancy, and they believe this only involves getting rid of a microscopic cluster of meaningless human cells. As I say, that's what I used to believe as a young man. But many people, and even many countries and American states, are changing their minds, because the debate surrounding abortion has been altering rapidly, not, as we often think, due to religious or moral objections or to the opinions of conservatives, which we've always had, but because of neonatal science, neurology, DNA studies, cell biology, CAT scanning, surgery on infants in the womb, and so on. We know that a human heart starts beating at around 21 days because we can now see it and hear it, which we never used to be able to do. That a human life in the womb has a distinct and unique personal genetic endowment, and thus is in every strictly biological sense, a genetically complete and unique, if undeveloped, human life. And that studies with tiny digital cameras clearly show terrified second and third trimester babies trying desperately to escape the vacuum tube or other device inserted into their mother's wombs to suck away their lives or tear off their limbs. By now, millions have seen the moving photo of the tiny hand of baby Samuel. If you haven't seen it, you can Google it and you'll see it, called Baby Samuel, reaching out of a small incision in his mother's womb to grasp the surgeon's finger during an operation to mend his spina bifida. The ex utero surgery scenario is legally bizarre because once taken outside the womb for treatment, though still attached via the umbilical cord to its mother, a child becomes a full person with normal human and civil rights because he or she is then born alive, or if you like, separated completely from the body of its mother, which is the wording in the Canadian law. Therefore, it's now a human being. But when the young child, once the surgery is finished, is put back in the womb to finish gestation, he or she disappears again as a human being or a full person, deemed now to be without value once again and to have no legal defense or rights until and unless he or she is eventually born alive for a second time. These are simply the facts. And by the way, in jurisdictions like mine, in Canada, it's not true they have entirely no rights. They're basically dead as far as the civil law, criminal law is concerned. But they do have certain civil rights. For example, if an unborn child in my country is damaged by the drug addictions of its own mother, the child becomes a young human being. He can sue his own mother for damaging him while in the womb, even though he's considered a human being for that purpose. He's not considered a human being under the criminal law, or if she wants to avoid. In other words, she can kill him, but if she doesn't, he can sue her. So she thinks it's better off to kill him. Now, these are simply facts, and the distressing reality is that of the total of all abortions in the United States and Canada, about 10%, or well over 100,000 every year, take place in the second trimester. At this point, many unborn babies are about 12 inches long and weigh up to a couple of pounds. At this 5 or 6 month stage of development, when the human life to be determined looks in every way like a small human being, there are often so-called evacuation problems. And so the most efficient and safe way, quote unquote safe way, to get a sizable baby, that means safe to the mother, safe to get a sizable baby out of an unripe womb is in pieces by ripping off its arms and legs and crushing its head with forceps for easy extraction, after which extracted body parts are counted and thrown into a garbage pail. Those who want to read a viscerally upsetting description by an American physician of his real-life accidental encounter with recently aborted babies and all their body parts, which fell out of a hospital garbage truck onto the street in front of him, should read the essay on my own website called, just go to my website where it says essays and scroll down. It's called The Street of the Dead Fetuses. Those who don't believe these grisly facts can search online for abortion photos to see shocking pictures of babies acid burned to death or torn apart in the way that I'm describing. It's going to make you feel sick. And there's more. Some 32 U.S. states have banned third trimester abortions because unborn children at this stage are very large, about 20 inches and between 6 and 8 pounds. As mentioned, Canada has no law whatsoever against late-term abortions, and it is true that even where they are allowed, or more precisely, not prohibited, most abortionists will refuse to perform them, but not all of them. And when women who want to get rid of their large second or third trimester babies do find a willing abortionist, there's an especially gruesome practice called partial birth abortion. It's formally called intact dilation and extraction, that I'm obliged to describe here briefly, because although it was successfully banned in 2003 by President George Bush, Liberal President Bill Clinton, before him, refused to ban it outright because he wanted to preserve the technique for mothers whose lives were endangered, which was a flimsy reason because there were microscopically small numbers of women whose lives were endangered. Ultra-liberal President Barack Obama, when a senator, refused to vote against it on several occasions. And one of his first acts as president was to reverse Bush's ban on the U.S. funding of abortions in other countries. This is an interesting kind of ideological ping pong, because the very first executive order that President Trump signed when he became president was the banning of U.S. funding of abortion services in foreign countries. So these presidents are doing ideological warfare with their executive orders every time they come into office. What was this conflict of presidential authority but an embodied instance of the moral war in the Great Divide? It is impossible to verify if, where, or when this method may now be used in Canada, but there is no law to stop it, and no one is telling. In the last year for which I have actually seen numbers for the United States, and so that would have been numbers for the 1970s and 80s, the National Coalition of Abortion Providers estimated, because no one knows, right? A lot of this is behind closed doors, that 4,000 to 5,000 partial birth procedures took place in the United States. Ron Fitzsimmons, then executive director of this organization, told the New York Times in 1997 that in the vast majority of cases, the procedure was being performed on a healthy mother with a healthy fetus of 20 weeks or more, and he confessed that, quote, he had lied through his teeth, unquote, about its employment, and that watching this procedure had made him, quote, physically ill, unquote. He nevertheless continued to support a right to abortion. Here's ideology creeping in again. And he was honest enough to add that one of the facts of abortion is that women enter abortion clinics to kill their own fetuses. He still didn't have the nerve to say to kill their own babies. He said, however, quote, it is a form of killing. You are ending a life, which is what I've been arguing here. For the conservative, this refreshing frankness cannot repair the moral error, but it is an improvement on liberal lying. Now I'm going to tell you what this method is about. Hope nobody feels sick, but I do almost every time I describe it. In this method, in almost all cases, the unborn child's position in the womb is manipulated until it can be pulled out of the womb, starting with feet first. So the physician does a lot of manipulating, or the midwife, whatever, turning the child around till it's heading out the door, feet first. The physician then gets in there and grabs a hold of the feet with his forceps or whatever. When the abortion then keeps pulling the baby out of the mother, but he doesn't want to go to jail for murder. So when he sees the back of the baby's head, he stops pulling. He takes a sharp instrument out of his kit and he jams it into the back of the baby's skull. Observers who have seen this have said that at that precise moment, the child startles as if falling off a cliff. The abortionist then inserts a vacuum hose into the hole that he has made in the head and sucks out the brain so that he can collapse the skull. This makes extraction of the baby easier. An alternative method he uses is by cutting or so-called disarticulating the neck, which means the abortionist manually slices through or breaks the baby's neck prior to extraction. See, he wants the child to be dead before he pulls it out. If he pulls it out alive and it dies, he gets charged with murder. So the legal reason for the partial birth technique is to kill the baby before its entire body leaves the birth canal, when by law it would transform, again, it is a kind of magical transformation from a thing into a human being, and would expose the medical staff to charges of murder. Now, 32 U.S. states, as well as the Supreme Court in the U.S., have banned this procedure, although all include exceptions in the event of the life of the mother needs to be saved. In such cases, the Supreme Court specified that there must be an injection that kills the fetus first. So a natural and ultimate moral question that rears its head for the conservative is this: when not forbidden by the laws of the people, and especially when subsidized through the tax system, these acts necessarily implicate the entire nation morally. Accordingly, is it possible for any reasonable person to say that these killings are right and good, or that a country that sanctions them is right and good? And if they are evil, as they seem to be, is not a country that refuses to forbid them also evil? Now that brings to an end my treatment of this topic in my book, The Great Divide. And we have a few minutes left, so I'm going to turn now to some sections of the War Against the Family, in which I have a chapter called The Invisible Holocaust, which is what we're going to use as a title for this video. That's a 50-page chapter. If you read it, you're going to see in detail the legal and moral arguments and historical arguments which brought the Western democracies to this situation, and you're going to see much more of the grisly details, which I'm going to give you a few right now. This is from a section of the chapter called Getting Rid of the Evidence. I think it would be hard to read any of this or hear it and not ask yourself what kind of people we have become. All hospitals and clinics in Canada are governed by some sort of Human Tissues Act. And in a normal hospital setting, whatever is removed from the mother's womb is directed to a pathology laboratory for analysis to make sure the mother was indeed pregnant, the baby was actually aborted, and nothing was left inside the womb. In all mid or late-term abortions that we have seen, there are quite visible body parts that must be analyzed and accounted for. You know, here's one arm. Oh, here's another arm. Here's a leg. Here's a foot. Here's the head, etc. You know, counting the body parts. After that, the so-called, here's what they call them, believe it or not, the products of conception, quote unquote, in Canada are usually sent to hospital incinerators. In freestanding clinics outside hospitals in most other countries, however, unless disease is present or the physician wants to protect himself against liability, the pathology stage is deemed an unnecessary extra expense and it is skipped. Then the aborted child is disposed of in other ways, says nurse Nita Witten of Dallas. I'm quoting her. If they were small enough, we hardly ever sent anything to the laboratory. We basically put them down the garbage disposal, or what we call a garburator in this country, a device in your sink that chews up old food. We put them down the garburator, quote unquote. Her colleague, nurse Kathy Sparks, says, and I'm quoting her again, and by the way, all the references for these quotes are in the back of my book, The War Against the Family. And some of these facts, as I saw them then, may have been altered by further study or changed or modified, but I think for the most part, this is all good, still good material. So Sparks said, oftentimes second trimester abortions were performed, and these babies we would not put in the little jar with the label to send off to the pathology lab we would put them down a flush toilet. That's where we would put these little babies, unquote. Winnipeg, the city of Winnipeg in my country, a Winnipeg pathologist said most hospitals use very large incinerators, but even large babies are no problem for a garbage disposal because the babies come out in pieces. And a good machine that can chew up the likes of a pork chop can easily handle a baby. That's quote unquote from him. It's absolutely astonishing and disgusting. More horrifying yet, and fraught with this historical tremor, is a copy of a brochure from an Austrian firm, listen to this, promoting the sale of its mini crematoriums. It shows 3 backyard barbecue-sized gas-fired ovens that generate temperatures up to 1150 degrees Celsius. The banner over the photograph says, "If you want the highest efficiency," quote unquote. The underlying specifications state that these ovens, quote, have the capability to burn 1 or 2 baby corpses within 1 hour. Larger ovens can burn up to 3 kilograms of human material or 20 to 30 preborn babies, unquote. Notes are in the back of the book. You can look it up yourself. Here's a section called Fetal Harvesting and Designer Fetuses. Dr. Bernard Nathanson, who was a famous American abortionist for years, after aborting literally thousands and thousands of babies, I think he estimated about 30,000 in his career, he eventually succumbed to the moral truth of what he was doing. I think he almost killed himself, but instead he ended up becoming a Christian, I believe, and he wrote a book about the evils that he had perpetrated and the evils of the abortion regimes taking place now in all the Western democracies. And he said, I'm quoting, "There is a flourishing commerce in the sale of fetal tissue and organs, such as at the Hanna Biologics Institute in Berkeley, California." Now, this book was published in 1993. I don't know if Hanna exists anymore, but it certainly did then. He describes how all sorts of fetal products are currently being used to help older patients sick with diabetes or with Parkinson's disease. Many so-called healthy aborted babies are needed for their brain cells. Such cells are also much in demand to treat Huntington's chorea, spinal cord injuries, leukemia, aplastic anemia, and radiation sickness, of all things. China attributes its success in such treatments to the aborting of, get this, 30-week-old babies. That was published in the Medical Post in February of 1990. Hanna forecasts sales of $3 billion a year for insulin derived from fetal pancreases and $8 billion a year from fetal brain tissue used for Parkinson's treatment. Margaret Somerville of McGill University here in Montreal, Canada, describes and warns against what she calls designer fetuses, which are aborted for the correct genetic match with the patient. But the new eugenics, quote, she says, has quietly slipped in the back door, unquote. Sorry, this is a quote by Jeremy Rifkin of Washington's Foundation for Economic Trends. He says the new eugenics has slipped in the back door. As scientists experiment with embryos and fetuses for answers to the making the genetically perfect human being, they vie with moral fervor for the right not only to excise disease-producing genes, but also to implant superhuman ones. In 1973, Dr. Robert Schwartz, the chief of pediatrics at the Cleveland Metropolitan Hospital, traveled regularly to Finland for fetal research disallowed in the United States at that time. Dr. Schwartz says that after a fetus is delivered, listen to this, while it is still linked to its mother by the umbilical cord, he takes a blood sample. Then he severs the cord, and then as quickly as possible, he removes organs and tissues while the heart is still beating. In 1977, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency approved a $300,000 project that used 100 aborted babies for testing the effects of pesticides on living tissue. That was reported in the Chicago Sun-Times on July 26, 1977. It seems a long time ago now, but it's not really. Research carried out at Canadian hospitals in the 1970s involved the dissection of 54 intentionally aborted babies from 10 to 20 weeks gestation for sex steroid research. At Stanford University, I'm going back now, even in the 1960s, Dr. Robert Goodwin, listen to this, he cut open the chest of live aborted babies to study their heart action. All of them died within 11 hours. In another project, the live beating hearts themselves were taken out of intentionally aborted babies, and their continuing contractions were studied while in a nutrient solution. The notes to that research are in the back of this book. In a macabre Finnish experiment, the U.S. doctor Peter A.J. Adam of Case Western Reserve Medical School harvested 12 babies by hysterotomy abortion, cutting off their heads while the babies were still living, and he attached the heads to a special machine that perfused them with various chemical studies that he wanted to substances that he wanted to study. Canada's limited research work on unborn babies is carried out mostly at Victoria General Hospital under Dr. Alan Fine of Dalhousie University. Remember, I say to my readers here, this is Canada, not Nazi Germany. Each pregnant woman signs 2 blanket consent forms, one for the abortion and one for the research use of her fetus. This is curious considering the baby is a non-person. So why does the mother have to give permission? A medical research team stands by when the baby is taken out because live warm tissue is the best. And after 4 hours, the baby's cells are useless. The desired cells, mostly from the brain, liver, pancreas, whatever, are quickly processed, is the term, for immediate use just down the hall, he says, as one critical physician put it. And there, he said, is a patient with, say, Parkinson's disease, waiting with a tube stuck in his head for the injection of those cells. 4 or more unborn babies may be required for each Parkinson's patient. Dr. Fine ingenuously writes that moral problems might exist if such research were, he says, I'm quoting, the sole reason for the abortion. If that was the sole reason for the abortion, that could be a legal or a moral problem, he says. Or if the fetus were living. But he dispels any moral qualms with the rationalization that what he calls the caseload of aborted fetuses is, his phrase, independently motivated, quote unquote. In other words, as long as women choose, get the word, as long as they choose to provide him with their aborted babies, the morality is not his problem. Apparently the Swedes under Dr. Ole Lindvall of Lund University in Sweden have perfected a low-flow suction technique. It allows them during a normal abortion procedure, and carefully guided by ultrasound, mind you, to stop the abortion and suck the baby's head off for brain cell harvesting before tearing out the rest of the body. Vancouver columnist Trevor Lottens, who happens to be a friend, gets close to this issue when he writes of, quote, the great and terrible horror of abortion, unquote, and asks, quote, how close to Nazism can you get? How close to what the historian H.R. Trevor Roper once called, in another context, the posthumous triumph of Hitler from the grave, unquote? A great question. But Dr. Nathanson forecast widespread use of fetal bone marrow for marrow transplant, fetal skin for those who have been burned, corneas for the blind, livers for the so-called factor VIII used in hemophilia, and so on. And he says then, this is the man who did these thousands of abortions and now deeply regrets it. He says, don't you see what is going to happen? After they are through selling us fetal tissue for vital issues, for those who are diseased, they will then go on to sell us non-vital tissues. Is your sex drive failing? How about a fetal gonad transplant? Is your hair going? We'll sell you some fetal scalp. Are your teeth going? We'll implant some fetal teeth for you. Robert J. Lifton, in his heartbreaking book, The Nazi Doctors, Medical Killing and the Psychology of Genocide, which is what we have now. This is a genocide, and it's taking place in all the Western democracies. And we're not talking whatever. We're talking millions upon millions of murdered, healthy human babies. He tells us in that book just how thousands of ordinary German doctors allowed themselves, these are people with high medical degrees and high doctoral degrees and so on, allowed themselves to be swept up in this process, what he calls pediatric euthanasia, or legalized abortion, is always the first stage, because it's easier for people to justify bumping off a supposedly invisible fetus than bumping off their parents or a spouse. One particularly scrupulous doctor of the Nazi era actually agonized, I believe he did, because he began as a moral being, but he didn't end as one. And this is how he got there. He actually agonized whether using gas was a medical means to euthanize people. Hitler answered that if it's at the table, this is recorded from transcripts in Robert J. Lifton's book, The Nazi Doctors. Hitler replied that if it is more humane than other methods, like, say, suffocation, and it's also cheaper, then what? Well, then it must be good. The relieved doctor then saw himself as very professional, using heroic efforts to save the state money, which could now be put to higher military uses. He had a fanatical colleague named Dr. Pfannmuller, and Pfannmuller said at the same meeting with the Nazi doctors that Hitler took part in, he said, I'm quoting, "The idea is unbearable to me that the best, the flower of our youth, must lose its life at the front in order that feeble-minded and irresponsible asocial elements can have a secure existence in an asylum," unquote. Well, at that point, he was talking about just using the methods of gas and all that for children in asylums, children who had severe medical difficulties or were brain problems, whatever. This man saw himself as essential to the highest cause as he hungered to euthanize the asocial elements and divert the savings that he created to the war front, thus trying to save the nation. And thus did all moral actions in the Nazi state eventually become ordered solely around service to abstract state ideals. Now, I'm finished with this talk, but I just want to say, if I can add it once more, that what we're talking about today in all the Western democracies, with very few exceptions, is the devotion and justification of the killing of millions of perfectly healthy unborn children for the sake of state ideals, namely the preservation of hyper-democratic ideology, as I have described it in all my work. And I hope someday after I'm gone, that this work will be recognized and people will realize the path that we have been on and that we are on today with a vengeance. The self-satisfaction and the moral confidence of people who support these kinds of techniques is literally indescribable and unbelievable. And the fact that they haven't ever thought about any of these arguments or pointed their finger at themselves is even more unbelievable. But the day will come. I once was blind, but now I see. So thank you for listening.